Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm Carol Parker, and I am leading the League of Women Voters California Food, Soil, and Ag team, as well as the League of Women Voters North County San Diego Climate Interest Group. And together we're hosting Michelle Fay, who's a program manager from Stop Waste, on to hear about SB 54 and the plastics and how SB 54 is going to change plastics in the country. I truly believe that. Okay, so let me introduce Michelle. Michelle has spent her last 2 decades working in the local government sector to help reduce waste and achieve a more circular economy in the San Francisco Bay Area. Michelle currently serves as a program manager at Stop Waste, the Alameda County Waste Management Authority, and leads several initiatives, including the Reusable Transport Packaging Project, and outreach to improve recycling and composting in support of state law SB 1383. She's also been a leader in the local government community on California's groundbreaking extended producer responsibility law for packaging. That's SB 54. She is currently leading SB 54 regulatory development efforts for jurisdictions in Alameda County and facilitating stakeholder discussions across the state for input in the rulemaking process. When she's not busy with her two teen daughters, she loves to connect with nature and friends on a good hike or camping trip. Welcome, Michelle.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So, as Carol mentioned, I work at a local government agency. Our nickname is Stop Waste. I don't know if anyone has heard of us before, but we're officially the Alameda County Waste Management Authority. And our goal is to reduce the amount of waste that is being sent to landfills from the businesses and residents of Alameda County. And for those of you who are maybe in Southern California, where we are is basically the East Bay Area. So we have cities like Berkeley, Oakland, all the way down to Fremont and east to Livermore. That's our jurisdiction with 17 individual cities and the two sanitary districts. So over the course of my time working in local jurisdiction or in local government, mostly I've been working to help businesses and multifamily properties understand how to recycle more and compost their food scraps. And I can tell you, as I'm sure you all are familiar, that anytime we talk about recycling and composting, it becomes really clear just how complicated our system is and how much, especially plastics, there seems to be in our waste stream. And it gets really hard trying to explain to people how to sort better when things are just so complicated, especially across jurisdiction lines, from city to city across the state or across the nation. So when SB 54 was passed in 2022, myself and my colleagues were just so excited because really what it represents is what we feel is the most ambitious plastic pollution prevention law in the world. And it aims to fix many of the long-standing concerns that we've been having around the volume of packaging, the volume of plastic in our lives, and the responsibility of meeting all these ambitious goals that it sets, which I'll talk about in just a moment, falls no longer on us as consumers, but more so on the producers of those. So this is what's called an EPR law, expanded producer responsibility, meaning the producers are responsible to solve the problem, not the consumers or local jurisdictions or our waste haulers. So our executive director at Stop Waste, his name is Timothy Burrows, and he has been appointed to the statewide SB 54 advisory board. And he's actually appointed as the chair. I believe it's a 16-member board. And they meet roughly once a month on the third Friday, usually. And because of his role on that advisory board, I get to work really closely with him and dive into the regulations and understand how this law is going to get implemented. So that's kind of like an overview of why I'm here talking about this, why it's important to us as local governments. So I think maybe now I will go ahead and share my screen. Let me see if I can do that here. One sec. All right. Do you see a cover slide?
Yes.
All right, great. Let's see. Let me just reorganize myself here. All right. So let's see here. So the law is officially titled the Plastic Pollution Prevention and Packaging Producer Responsibility Act, which is a bit of a mouthful. But as I mentioned, if implemented successfully, it will reduce the volume of plastic and other packaging in California and increase recycling with transparent tracking and measurement. It will also provide more clarity and consistency for consumers regarding what materials are, in fact, truly recyclable or compostable, including hopefully more consistency across our jurisdiction lines on what goes in each bin, which is awesome. We could definitely use that. It will also stimulate investment in the reuse and refill infrastructure in our state and drive innovation in packaging design in ways that are good for people and good for the planet. It's also going to create new money to clean up existing plastic pollution, particularly in disadvantaged communities, which are disproportionately impacted by the health and environmental consequences of the plastic pollution and fossil fuel extraction. And what this slide shows are the two main categories of the materials we're talking about when we talk about SB 54. The law is focused on single use packaging of any material and foodware. So these materials combined represent roughly a quarter of our overall waste stream. And the amount of these plastics specifically that actually get recycled is quite low. Only about 5% of plastics, according to our state agency, CalRecycle, are recycled. And as we know, plastic packaging is particularly problematic for a variety of reasons, as it oh, it looks like maybe someone is not muted.
Yeah, I think it's Trish may not be muted.
Okay. Thank you. So, as we know, there's a lot of problems with plastic packaging, particularly it can degrade in microplastics, and it's also made from the non-renewable petrochemicals. So, oops, went too far here. If the law is implemented successfully in our state by the year 2032, this is what we should see. All single-use packaging and foodware will be recyclable or compostable, and single-use plastic packaging will achieve a minimum 65% recycling rate. And that has a few incremental goals along the way. 30% recycling rate by 2028 and 40% by 2030. And as I mentioned in the slide before, plastic is only recycled in the low single digits right now. So this is a huge, ambitious goal for plastic producers. Not only does the packaging need to be recycled or composted, the amount of packaging that's put out into the California market must be source reduced. 25% reduction by weight and by unit must be achieved by 2032. And again, there are some interim goals along the way with specific reuse and refill goals as well. The law has specific requirements that are a little bit different for expanded polystyrene food service ware. And in order to be sold, distributed, or imported into California, styrofoam foodware must achieve a 25% recycling rate by next year, which is impossible. That will never happen. It's not going to happen. And so what this means is SB 54 has in effect banned polystyrene packaging throughout California. And CalRecycle recently submitted or released a statement to that effect, essentially saying that expanded polystyrene foodware can no longer be sold or distributed in the state starting next year. So, how is this all going to happen? The key sort of role to figure out how this is all going to get done is through the Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO. So, the law requires that producers of the materials that are covered by the law come together and form a PRO for the purposes of implementing and complying with the law. CalRecycle announced that the nonprofit organization called Circular Action Alliance has been selected to be California's PRO, and they will do things like help inform all the producers that are obligated under the law about what the requirements are. They will collect and report the producer data, and they will also start collecting fees from producers to fund the implementation of the law. As kind of a side note, Circular Action Alliance is also the PRO for similar EPR laws that were passed in both Colorado and Oregon. So there's some consistency, at least in terms of how producers will be informed and how things will get implemented from the PRO perspective. The PRO has until April 2026 to develop a draft implementation plan and budget, which will at least in part be identified through an SB 54 needs assessment. And that is being conducted by the state agency CalRecycle over the next 2 years. The Another key feature of the law is its focus on cleaning up existing messes created by the profusion of plastic pollution. Starting in 2027, the PRO must pay $500 million per year for 10 years into a dedicated California Plastic Pollution Mitigation Fund. These funds are separate from the fees that the PRO or producers will pay to fund the collection and processing infrastructure to meet the other goals of the law. And when we look at this $5 billion mitigation fund, there are specific parameters on how that money will be spent. 60% will go to monitor and reduce historical and current environmental justice and public health impacts of plastics. And this funding is intended to benefit specifically disadvantaged communities. And the funds will be allocated by state agencies, for example, in grants to tribes or local jurisdictions or NGOs. The other 40% of the money will be allocated to natural resource agencies such as Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Coastal Commission, to quote, and this is pulled straight from the statute, to reduce the environmental impacts of plastics on terrestrial, aquatic, and marine and human health, including to restore, recover, and protect the natural environment. So this is a really big deal. We have never had anything like this before in the state. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about recyclability and compostability. And if we think back a few slides where it said in California by 2032, all materials must be recyclable or compostable, or all packaging and foodware must be recyclable and compostable. We have to first understand, well, what does that mean? What does it truly mean to be recyclable or compostable? So what SB 54 does is it actually points to 2 prior laws that were passed in 2021 to help define those terms. So the law SB 343 is what defines recyclability. That law was passed in 2021, and we call it the Truth in Labeling Law. Under that law, in order for a material to be deemed recyclable, it must meet two criteria. First, at least 60% of the state's population must have access to a program that collects the material for recycling. Second, the material has to be sorted into a defined stream or bale by the transfer and processing facilities that collectively serve at least 60% of the state. So, kind of in summary, people have to have access to recycling of that material, and those materials have to actually be baled and sent for specific recycling. Under 343, any material that doesn't meet those two thresholds can no longer be labeled as recyclable. They can no longer include the chasing arrow symbol starting July of next year if they're not on the list of what's meeting that criteria. And so what you see on the left-hand side of this slide are the materials that were deemed to meet those two criteria in the first list that was published by CalRecycle in December of last year. And the way they looked at it was they organized, or they basically determined that there's 94 different covered material categories in the state that are essentially what's covered by SB 54. And out of those 94 categories, just 37 meet the criteria for recyclability. And I've summarized those on this slide. It's essentially glass and aluminum containers, paper and cardboard, as well as rigid plastics that are labeled with a 1, 2, or 5. Those are what are currently considered recyclable across the state. For those of you who are maybe less familiar with the plastic resin codes, a number 1 is something like a soda bottle or a water bottle. A number 2 is something like a milk jug or a detergent container. And number fives are typically things like yogurt tubs or containers. Even if those 1s, 2s, and 5s are made of what we call a thermoform process, so there's different types of or ways plastics are formed. Even thermoforms like plastic clamshells, like a berry container or a lettuce tub, those made the cut as what is considered recyclable based on the criteria on the right side of the screen. However, plastic utensils, film plastics, like flexible film that maybe wraps your paper towels, those are not recyclable in the state anymore. And poly-coated foodware, like paper coffee cups that you might get at Starbucks. It's paper with a thin layer of plastic on the inside. That is not considered recyclable in California anymore. So just to kind of put that into perspective on what that actually means, it means that manufacturers of those products can no longer call them recyclable. They can no longer put a recycling symbol on those materials. And then by 2032, unless they find a way to actually meet the criteria of what is recyclable, they can no longer sell or distribute or produce those materials in California. So they have, what is that, 8 years. They have 8 years to figure out what they're going to do if their materials are not considered recyclable under this law. In the meantime, it'll be a little bit of a kind of a fuzzy zone where these materials are still on the market, but they're not actually being called recyclable, which is a good thing, I think. Couple other things I'll mention on this slide. There's things, what we call aseptic cartons. Those are shelf-stable milks, like an almond milk carton or a soup carton where it's lined with a thin aluminum layer and plastic and cardboard, as well as gable-top milk cartons. Those are not recyclable. But one of maybe the biggest surprises, and we wouldn't be surprised if it changes in the next iteration of this list, is based on the criteria that was on the right side of the screen, tin, steel, bimetal cans. So you can see the cans on the far right side, those did not meet the thresholds for being considered recyclable, which we thought was a little bit strange. According to the study they conducted, only 24% of the state's population collects these for recycling, and only 33% of the surveyed counties have a materials recycling facility that actually recovers them. So I think my sort of hunch, and this is kind of off the record, is maybe there was something in the way they collected the information that if they were just looking at what jurisdictions post on their website, which is how they collected it, maybe jurisdictions don't specifically call out that they collect these containers because they're kind of a given material, and maybe a website didn't show it or a brochure didn't show it, but they are in fact collected. And if somebody puts them in the recycling, they're not going to be actually thrown out as a residual material or contamination. So we'll see. The next list is due out by January 1. So under SB 54, the state has to update the list of what's considered recyclable and compostable every year. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but I will stay on after we have a few more slides to get through, and then I'm happy to answer questions. I know this, I'm putting a lot of information out to you all, and I wouldn't be surprised if you have questions. So happy to do that at the end. So let's look at compostability. Essentially, in order to be labeled a compostable product in California, um, products must meet standard specifications, and they can no longer contain the harmful forever chemicals known as PFAS. And those are often used in paper foodware to create a moisture barrier on things like molded fiber foodware, like a molded tray or a molded plate. So those PFAS chemicals are very harmful to people and the environment, and those can no longer be used in the state. And products must also be distinguishable from other non-compostable products to be labeled as compostable. And finally, and most importantly, perhaps, starting January 2026, products must be accepted in feedstock used to produce compost that is used in organic agriculture. And for reference, compostable plastics are not currently accepted as a feedstock in compost that is used for organic agriculture. So that means starting January 2026, compostable plastics will no longer be able to be labeled compostable. They can still be sold in the state until 2032. And what happens between now and then remains to be seen in terms of what manufacturers of those materials are going to do to continue to be sold. Perhaps they'll change the way they make their products. We've heard lots of innovation happening in this world where manufacturers are looking at things like shrimp shells to make it looks like plastic, but it's 100% shrimp shells, or algae based packaging and those in theory would be compostable and would meet this criteria because they could be allowed in organic agriculture. So this is kind of an exciting realm where we are really interested to see what happens. Let's see here. What else did I want to say on this slide? Maybe I forgot to mention, but the law that governs what is called compostable in the state is called AB 1201. And things like paper plates lined with plastic or paper cups lined with plastic, like I mentioned the prior slide on recyclability, those also can no longer be considered compostable. So I think that covers compostability. And what's so amazing about SB 54 is it builds on those existing laws, but it adds more layers of protection. It says not only do you have to meet those criteria of AB 1201 and SB 343, but you also can't be labeled compostable unless we can verify that those materials are actually sent to what the law calls a responsible end market. Um, and so it defines a responsible end market as essentially entities must be compliant with all the required permits, licenses, and regulations in their jurisdiction. And the recycling must be done in a transparent way. There has to be a documented chain of custody. Records must be maintained at each step along the way, and each step in the process towards that responsible end market must be willing to be inspected at any point by the PRO or by the state agency, CalRecycle, so that we can actually verify when we say something is going to be recycled, we can actually track where it goes and verify that it was done in a way that is benefiting people and the environment and not causing harm. So that is a really, really important part. And from our perspective, when, over the course of the past 5 years or so, we've been seeing different articles in the, major news channels saying, hey, we don't think materials are actually getting recycled in a responsible way. This law is actually taking a stance against that and trying to do something about it, which is just really exciting. So this timeline slide has a lot of information. I won't go over everything, but mostly what I just want to point out is where we're at in the rulemaking process. So the statute, the law was passed in 2022, and it included the process that rules or regulations need to be developed and finalized by January 1 of 2025. So CalRecycle has about a month left to get those all in order. There's been a couple different iterations, a couple of drafts that have gone out for public review, and our agency has been very involved in reading those regulations, trying to understand what the implications are, and making sure the local government and voices of our communities are being heard and represented in how the regulations are drafted. The regulations are over 200 pages. So there's a lot of content in there. And really, what we're finding is that, the devil is in the details on how this law is getting implemented. And that's why we are just really trying to be involved in this process. And we're thankful for our director's position as the chair on the advisory board that's really also taking a very significant role in helping shape the regulations. You can also see some other key dates on the screen as well. Producers must start paying fees into the system starting July of 2026. And then in January 2027, those fees will then get passed along as payments to local jurisdictions, to those disadvantaged communities as part of the mitigation fund, to haulers, to all the people that are going to be involved in making this law a success to actually meet the goals. So what we're realizing is that while the burden of this plastic pollution is going to now fall on producers, the actual implementation of it is going to be a combined effort across the state, from local jurisdictions and waste providers and nonprofit organizations, and new things like recycling depots might be built, or there's a lot of innovation that's going to happen, but it's all going to be built on the existing infrastructure of our solid waste system. And producers are going to basically have to pay us to do their job, which is to meet the goals of the law. So we're figuring out what that's going to look like. It's still very fuzzy in my mind on how that actually happens. But we're excited to be at the table and help kind of inform what that is going to look like. But we're also looking to the expertise of the producers. They're the ones who have big, big dollars marketing their products in the state. And we want to know how they think we should achieve the goals of the law. How do we meet a 65% plastic recycling? Because we've been trying to do it and we haven't been successful. So let's hear what they have to say. Let's put their big dollars into this and see how we're going to succeed. Last slide here. I briefly just want to mention kind of ways to get involved. One of the best ways is to, if you're interested in learning more and keeping apprised of the topic, is to join the CalRecycle list serve. And I can put a link in the chat in just a moment, where you can sign up for the list serve and get emails along the way. If you can, you'll be notified on the listserv emails of when CalRecycle hosts workshops. So I would recommend attending those. And then also that, as I mentioned, the SB 54 Advisory Board meets roughly once a month. And that's a really good way to kind of hear how this law is getting implemented and where things are at in the process. And also, the advisory board does a great job of opening on the agenda different times for public feedback and public input. So that's where a lot of public opinions are being heard, and CalRecycle is in the room for those, which is important. And those meetings you can attend in person if you're in the Sacramento area, but they also are hosted on Zoom or via webcast. And they've been getting anywhere from 100 to 200 people in attendance at those meetings. So that's been great. Um, and then you can also submit written comment letters to CalRecycle if you do start diving into the details. And if you can't attend workshops or develop your own comments, you can leverage any existing effort or existing partnerships that you may have. One that we're really involved with is the National Stewardship Action Council, and NSAC for short, working with different local government organizations through that. And you can connect with folks like Cal Cities or the California State of Associated Counties. Lots of different organizations are working at the state level to inform this. So if you happen to be working with any of those organizations, those are also good channels to be engaged. So I think that's my last slide here. And I think what I will do is happy to answer questions. And it looks like we have one. If that's okay, I can start with Mary.
Yes, first, thank you so much, Michelle, for your work and an incredibly informative presentation here. And it's a phenomenal amount of work. I know our city tried very hard years ago to get to the end, like where were we actually sending things, and you actually couldn't find out at that time, right? So
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
huge. So my first is thank you so much, and also because I think that direct knowing where things go, that requirement is really going to be huge. I though then have two-part question. The first one is, did I hear you correctly when you said regarding the materials that are made in California? Does that mean you can import from another state cans that do not have these recycling requirements on them? So that's the first one. And then the second one is so what about jurisdictions who have already invested, really large sums of money, including partnering with other cities to develop compost facilities that will take commercial compost facilities that will take things like milk cartons, which are not on the list. So how is that going to work? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good questions. So maybe I'll start with your second question, which is, you're right. There's a lot of jurisdictions that have already invested in both recycling and compost collection facilities. And specifically to the point about like milk cartons, for example. We in Alameda County, we did the same thing. I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. We were kind of one of the first in the state to start expanding yard waste collection to include food waste. And then we would say things like, put your food waste in a milk carton and put that all in the green bin. And at that time, we believed that milk cartons or ice cream cartons were lined with wax. Well, they're not anymore. They maybe were at one point. A milk carton is actually lined with plastic, a thin layer of plastic. And we definitely don't want to be putting plastic in our compost,
Right.
which then gets broken down and creates tiny bits of plastic that then gets land applied. And then we have rain that comes down and washes those microplastics into our waterways. So we are learning from past mistakes. And through laws like SB 54, we have a chance to kind of right the wrongs, do things differently, to say, hold on, what are we accepting in our programs? And is that really the right thing to be doing? And if not, we're going to start changing those things and start saying, you know what? Milk cartons don't belong in the green bin anymore, but maybe there are new markets that are being developed by producers, because now it's their responsibility to develop the markets. If they want to keep using a milk carton, they have to figure out a way to either make it recyclable or compostable. And we don't think it's going to be compostable unless they start lining it with shrimp shells. That sounds kind of gross. But or some other type of film that is truly compostable. We've heard innovations that milk cartons, maybe that thin layer of plastic is not a problem for the recycling system. That fiber is actually really valuable material that packaging manufacturers want. And we're hearing them say, we want you to put the milk carton in the blue bin. We don't mind that thin layer of plastic that's on there. We can handle it appropriately and we can ensure it gets recycled. So those are the types of things that we're starting to hear. And the law will hopefully, if we're doing this correctly, will create some sort of guideposts to ensure that what producers are saying is happening is actually true, and that we can verify that that is a good place to put milk cartons, for example. So does that kind of answer that question?
Yes, that does. That's very specific to the milk cartons, but I guess then we have to look at everything, because as you say, when they were being made of wax, then they could be recycled. And I know that was the criteria in our jurisdiction. So anything as a different type of lining can't go into compost. But I guess, well, I don't drink milk, so I don't know. I can't even tell you what they look like now. So yeah, so that's very helpful, because it's going to force then, will the producers have to label then what they're actually made of? Because I think if you ask the majority of people, they would say, yeah, that's a thin layer of wax, not a thin layer of paper or plastic.
Yeah, that brings up a really good point that I didn't touch on, but I'm glad you bring it up. So what is this going to mean for labeling and consumer education? And that really is compounded by the fact that the list of what is deemed recyclable and compostable, in theory, is changing every year. I mean, there won't be like significant shifts, I don't think, but maybe, a material or two will kind of pop in or pop off the list. And so this is just my thinking, and I don't know for certain, but my guess, my hunch, is we're not going to be so focused anymore on what the material is made out, what the packaging is made out of. What we're instead going to rely on is labeling that says if it's recyclable or if it's compostable. Because what actually is recyclable or compostable could shift over time based on new responsible end markets that get developed. And so we're going to start, I think, to see the PRO start to implement new campaigns to inform the public, to say, hey, if we get it, we've been burned by recycling for a little while. We haven't been able to trust it, but we have new laws in place. And we want you to be able to trust that if something says it's recyclable, it actually is. And if something says it's compostable, it actually is. So look for these labels and clear labeling.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the other one, what about things that are produced elsewhere? So
Yes.
cans.
So great question also. And this is kind of sort of like, how do I frame it? Like one of the best parts about the law and the most frustrating parts about the law is how it defines a producer. Basically, it is trying to get at all products that are coming into the state, whether it's manufactured in China or manufactured in Wisconsin. Any product, or of the covered materials, packaging and foodware, it doesn't matter where it's made. It is covered by SB 54 if it's being imported or sold in the state. So that means even things that are coming from Amazon. But what that also means is that it makes it so California can't regulate, you know,
Mhm.
a Mexican manufacturer.
Mm-mm.
So what it means is that we have to be flexible in where the definition of producer is applied. So it
Mhm.
might be the person or the organization making the product, or it might be the distributor that is bringing the product into California, or it might be the organization that is packaging the thing in California. So the way the law structures the definition of producer is basically to apply to the sort of first person they can, uh, so that all materials covered by the law are in fact regulated.
And has this been challenged then? Is there any lawsuits pending over that?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent presentation. Excellent
just-
answers.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank Michelle. You know, I think this is a wonderful, I gotta say, it just seems like SB 54 has really been thought through. And that, you know, it's a, you know, you've really covered a lot of issues. And so I really appreciate that. And, you know, especially the, paying for the plastic pollution. I think that that's just really fabulous. So anyways, well,
Yeah.
go to Elizabeth has a question now.
Thank you.
There's some in the chat. We have had written down questions in the chat for a while.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry about that. I didn't
Yeah.
see those.
Okay.
Well, let's have Elizabeth give her question and then we can read the
Okay.
questions from the chat.
Thank you. I would echo all the wonderful comments about this presentation and the implementation of this bill. I did attend a workshop with Senator Allen right after it happened. He said that one of the important things of this bill is that it will go across the whole country. Everybody has to do this. It sounds like that's what's going to start happening. So that's very exciting. I guess my one concern is the enforcement. I think you've touched on a little bit, but like with SB 1383, it's just all over the place still. And I mean, I'm so looking forward to this happening. I guess the education and the enforcement are my two biggest issues. Who will be doing the enforcement, especially if it changes every year?
Yeah, exactly. So Cal Recycle has the authority to enforce the law, and there are actually very tough enforcement provisions built into the regulations. In fact, we would argue too tough when it comes to local jurisdictions, and this is one of the points we're fighting against in our comments to Cal Recycle. So they have essentially said that the violation or administrative fines can be assessed up to $50,000 per day for non-compliance. And we think that, you know, that's great when it comes to giant pocket producers. However, they also are saying they can enforce to that level on a local jurisdiction that doesn't do we have one requirement. I didn't cover it today, but basically local jurisdictions have one thing they have to do under the law, and that is we are required to accept all materials in our bins that are deemed to be recyclable or compostable across the state. We have to collect those. So if a jurisdiction doesn't collect a number one plastic, for example, they could be fined up to $50,000 per day, which we think is ridiculous. We should not be held to that same amount. But the other thing too is the PRO will be not necessarily enforcing per se, but they will be the ones gathering all the data and it essentially determining what fees each producer has to pay into the system. And so there are mechanisms in the program as well to ensure that those fees get paid. But it is a concern. We want to make sure there aren't free riders and that this law is going to be enforced. So something to for sure keep an eye on as we move forward. Yeah, good point.
Okay, so
Okay. Yeah.
Carol has a question. Do you anticipate an increase of metal and glass packaging? And if so, what is the impact of that on climate?
Yeah, great question.
And there's a second part is, will
Sure.
SB 54 resolve the problem with cans and making them recyclable?
Okay, great. So I think there will be definitely a shift in how our materials are packaged. And unfortunately, the law is somewhat agnostic on what materials that packaging gets shifted to. So it doesn't really look at what the overall environmental impacts or climate impacts that a package might have. So that is perhaps, could be considered one of the downsides, is that we don't want to just switch from one single use package to another that maybe has more impacts than plastic if you look at the whole life cycle analysis, especially if that material, for example, to let's talk about, a stainless steel container, perhaps needs to be used 50 times in order to offset the impacts of that reusable. So we're also very involved in wanting to make sure that the reuse and refill components of the law are written in such a way that ensure materials are truly, in fact, reused or refilled if that's the intent of that material. But you know what? You have to start somewhere. I keep thinking as we go through this process, I think in the back of my mind, oh, kind of put a pin in it of like, oh, well, that might be a future law that needs to be talked about. We can't address everything at one time. So these are things to be thinking about is, do we need to do something about what the overall impact is of our packaging? This specifically is trying to reduce plastic, which is a very noble endeavor and a really important first step. And I will also say just kind of a little like anecdotal example to show that I think the law is already having an impact. My partner was at Lowe's the other day, and he was buying a kit to replace old fluorescent can lights in the ceiling. And he bought LEDs instead. And when he opened the package, he's like, oh, you got to see this, Michelle, you're going to love it. There is not a single piece of plastic in the box. The whole light unit was cradled in a cardboard sort of nest. And then there was different bags in the box that held different components like screws and whatever else you use to switch these out. Not my expertise, but there was like 4 different bags in this box and they were all paper. They were little tiny paper bags, not plastic bags. And I was like, I'm sure this has got to be because SB 54. And we've heard from packaging manufacturers, that, a year and a half ago saying, we're getting calls nonstop saying, how do I switch my package to be compliant with this law? So that's a great example of how we're already seeing manufacturers shift and reduce the plastic. Sorry, I don't know, how much time do we have? I keep rambling on. I get excited about this, but one small little example too. I was at Trader Joe's and the broccoli package used to be like, a third empty plastic on top, and the volume of broccoli was the same, but the plastic packaging ended right at the top of the broccoli. There was no longer this, extra plastic. And so again, the law says you have to cut plastic packaging by 25%. So manufacturers are starting to figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to say I have a good example in I go to get these collagen peptides from Costco, and they used to be in this plastic jug, so big. And now it's packaged in what looks kind of like a modified oatmeal container.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I mean, it still has like probably plastic coated cardboard, but I would believe that that could then go into regular cardboard recycling.
Yeah, I've been seeing those containers as well. Yeah, exactly.
And
So,
then
well, oh, go ahead.
there was the other question about the cans, making the cans recyclable.
I think so. I think they will. That's my guess. I could be wrong, but we're waiting anxiously to see what the new list in January shows for those. But I think they're going to be determined recyclable. And if not, the producers of those containers, I think, will be either filing a lawsuit or really trying to demonstrate to Cal Recycle, hey, you got this wrong. Let us show you these materials are in fact recycled. So, and they of course have been, up in arms and already very vocal in different public meetings and with Cal Recycle to say, no, these are recyclable.
Okay, so then Regina has several questions about will the producers pass the added cost of the fees onto the consumer? And is the hope that the producers switch to glass and non-plastic options?
Yeah, great question. So there is a chance that, this is another one where, maybe there's future laws that address this, but right now there's nothing that says a packaging producer can't pass along their costs into the costs of their product or their packaging. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some slight incremental costs that get added to the products that we buy. However, Cal Recycle did do an economic impact analysis, and they did not indicate that they thought it was going to be significant. So we'll see. We shall see. But also, I studied my degrees in environmental studies, and one of the first things I remember learning about in college was that we are not paying for the environmental costs of all of our consumption. So part of me is kind of like, so be it. We need to start paying for what it actually costs to appropriately manage downstream and upstream source reduction. So I don't know. That's just me, but I think it's important that costs include the environmental harm that we're doing. And then is the hope that producers will switch to glass or non-plastic options? I think that they will inevitably because they have to meet the 25% plastic source reduction goal, but maybe less so glass and metal. What we're seeing more is fiber. Like you said, with your collagen peptides, those are in a paper. Is it a round, like a round cylinder? Yeah, I've been seeing those a lot too. And like I said, with the can light example, it went from a plastic baggie or a plastic cradle for a light to paper. And that's what we're seeing more of. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's more the direction is that we head.
So then Muriel has a question about how does this apply to packaged products mailed to us by Amazon?
They are covered by the law. So they will have to meet the goals of the law as well. So 65% of all plastic has to be recycled and they have to source reduce by 25%. And they are obligated producers under the law. So they all have to join the PRO and pay fees into the system.
So that, and then Regina also had a question about the reusable plastic bags that grocers use covered in the bill. But that's going to be those are going to be banned as of January 2026.
Correct.
Due to Catherine Blakespears, who's my state senator. So she got a bill passed this year for that.
Yeah, we're really excited to see that. So no more plastic bags in another year or so. But that does mean we'll have more paper. So be really important.
Bring your reusable bags.
Exactly. Continue to promote source reduction, bring your reusables and recycling of those bags.
So I did want to say that I went on a tour of my local waste hauler, recycling and compostable their facilities, which I highly recommend if you are in any other jurisdiction that for your local league to have a tour of your local waste hauler, recycling and compostable stuff, organic waste. it's really interesting. But, and one thing that they told me is that Starbucks cups are all compostable now
Mm,
for their facility. It might be different in different people's facilities, but that Starbucks has changed their manufacturing for the lining of the cup. And also the plates that you can get, the Dixie plates that you can get from Costco are now acceptable for their organic waste facility. So yeah, I think things are definitely going to be changing. I think manufacturers are getting on board with the whole lowering plastic and but I think that, you know, California is such a big economy and that we are going to be driving it across the country. I think that is just really, you know, fabulous.
absolutely. And so it's interesting that Starbucks is now using essentially a compostable liner with their paper cup. And as of right now, starting 2026, that would no longer be compliant. So they're going to have to figure out a new solution. So we shall see. This is the exciting part. It's no longer on our shoulders to figure out. They are going to have to figure out how to comply. Yeah, Janice.
Okay, I just want to shift the mindset, okay, a little bit. I was
Yeah.
a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, in Niger, on the edge of the Sahara Desert. They did not take plastic. We did not drink out of plastic. We did not bag anything in plastic. So what do you use before? You use baskets that are woven that can be basically washed and reused if you need to. You use cloth that you can carry home, and then you can wash that up if you need to do that. And you use containers, like the container. I take a glass container to our local Filling Good, or I mix up the names of the Feel Good
Yes.
filling stations where you refill glass or cloth or a basket, you know, and it's something that is a circular thing that you can use all the time, that you don't have to be in this narrow framework of bag, and it has to be either paper. We can't afford that on the planet to use up all our trees for paper, and you know, I mean, we need paper for something. Anyway, I just want to open it up a little bit and say hello to Timothy from us
Oh,
in Berkeley.
oh,
Regina, Cynthia, and I have worked with Timothy before.
oh, okay. I'm writing your names down.
Thank you.
So Janice, thank you so much for mentioning that. I 100% agree with you, and I'm hopeful that SB 54 will get people to think more outside of the box and think more about reuse and refill. And the reason I am hopeful of that is because that 25% source reduction goal must include 2%, or sorry, 4% of that must be achieved by switching to reuse and refill systems. And it sounds really small, but for the entire state, and we essentially have none. I mean, of course, in Berkeley and Oakland and some areas we can go reuse or, you know, refill containers, but most people across the state don't have access to that. So to get from essentially a 0% up to 4% of our source reduction being through reuse and refill specifically is kind of monumental and has never been done before. And I'm really hopeful that this, and we're seeing it already, that the producers are starting to figure out, okay, how are we going to get people to reuse things? How are they going to, how do we create a system for refill? So super exciting. And thank you for bringing that perspective. I 100% agree.
Well, I think it's, we are up to the hour, and so we need to wrap up here. I just want to say thank you so much. This has been extremely informative, and I think it's going to be a huge change. And you know, I just want to thank everybody that's been involved in this. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you having me, and thank you all for listening. Appreciate it.